March 7th, 1945. Camp Carson, Colorado. 23 Japanese prisoners of war stood in the cold mountain air, staring at a long wooden barracks building. The structure looked ordinary enough from the outside. Weathered pine boards, a pitched roof, windows with glass panes intact. But the prisoners would not move. They had been standing there for 40 minutes while American guards grew increasingly frustrated. The translator, a Nisei soldier named Thomas Nakamura from the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, tried again to explain. The barracks were their quarters. They should go inside. The prisoners did not move. Staff Sergeant William Hayes from Amarillo, Texas, had been handling POW operations for 8 months. He had processed Italian prisoners, German prisoners, even a few Romanian deserters. None of them had refused to enter their assigned quarters. But these 23 Japanese soldiers, captured 3 weeks earlier on Iwo Jima, stood motionless in the March wind, shivering in their thin cotton uniforms, refusing to approach the building. Hayes asked Nakamura what the problem was. Nakamura spoke with the senior Japanese prisoner, a sergeant named Takeshi Yamamoto. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The conversation took several minutes. Finally, Nakamura turned to Hayes with an expression somewhere between confusion and disbelief. The prisoners thought it was a trick. They believed the Americans were trying to lure them into the building to execute them. They had been told by their officers before capture that Americans tortured prisoners before killing them. The barracks looked too substantial, too permanent. Japanese soldiers did not live in buildings like that. Therefore, it must be a trap. Hayes considered this information. Then he walked to the barracks door, opened it, and went inside. The heating system was running. The interior temperature was approximately 68 degrees Fahrenheit. The barracks contained 40 beds, each with a mattress, 2 wool blankets, and a pillow. There were electric lights overhead, already switched on. There were windows with curtains. There was a wood stove in the center for supplemental heat, though the steam radiator system made it largely unnecessary. At one end of the room sat a table with benches for eating or writing letters. The floor was swept clean. Hayes walked back outside and gestured for the prisoners to follow him. They did not move. He tried a different approach. He took off his coat, handed it to another guard, and lay down on the cold ground in front of the barracks. He lay there for 30 seconds, then stood up, brushed himself off, and pointed at the barracks again. The message was clear. If the Americans wanted the prisoners dead, they would already be dead. There would be no elaborate deception. The prisoners conferred among themselves. Finally, Sergeant Yamamoto stepped forward. He would enter first. If he was killed, the others would know the truth. Yamamoto walked slowly to the door. He paused at the threshold, looked back at his men, then stepped inside. 45 seconds passed. Then Yamamoto reappeared in the doorway. His expression had changed completely. He spoke rapidly to the other prisoners. One by one, they approached the building. They entered cautiously, as if expecting an ambush from every corner. Inside, they found exactly what Hayes had shown them. A heated room, real beds with mattresses, electric lights, clean floors, windows with glass. One prisoner touched a radiator and jerked his hand back from the heat. Another sat carefully on a bed, testing whether it would collapse. A third simply stood in the center of the room, turning slowly, examining everything. Nakamura watched their reactions. He had grown up in California before the war. His family had been interned at Manzanar while he fought in Italy with the 442nd. He understood both cultures. What he was witnessing was not just surprise. It was complete psychological disorientation. These men had been told specific things about American treatment of prisoners. Everything they were seeing contradicted those things. The contradiction was so profound, they literally could not process it without physical proof. Hayes asked Nakamura to explain the facilities. The beds were theirs to use. The blankets were theirs to keep. The heat would run continuously throughout the night. Meals would be delivered 3 times daily. There was a latrine building 50 feet away with running water and flush toilets. Medical care would be provided in the camp infirmary. They would be issued winter clothing, American Army surplus, coats, gloves, boots, because the thin cotton uniforms they wore were inadequate for Colorado in March. They would receive pay for work assignments, 80 cents per day for labor, paid in camp scrip, redeemable at the canteen for cigarettes, candy, and other items. The Geneva Convention governed all treatment. Abuse was forbidden. Escape attempts would be punished, but not with execution. Letters to family in Japan could be written and would be transmitted through neutral countries when possible. Nakamura translated all of this. The prisoners listened in silence. When he finished, Sergeant Yamamoto asked a question. Nakamura translated it for Hayes. "Why are you treating us like this?" Hayes thought for a moment before answering. "Because that's what the rules say. You're prisoners of war. We follow the Geneva Convention." Nakamura translated. Yamamoto asked another question. "What happens when you don't need prisoners anymore?" Hayes understood what was really being asked. "Nothing happens. The war ends. You go home. That's how it works." But that answer assumed these prisoners believed they would survive long enough to go home. That assumption would take months to establish. The war between Japan and the United States had been underway for 3 years and 3 months when those 23 prisoners arrived at Camp Carson. In that time, American forces had captured relatively few Japanese prisoners, not because Americans refused to take prisoners, though combat conditions sometimes made capture difficult, but because Japanese soldiers rarely surrendered. The reasons for this were complex, rooted in military culture, propaganda, and official policy. Japanese military training emphasized that surrender was the ultimate dishonor. The imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors, issued in 1882 by Emperor Meiji, stated explicitly that death was preferable to the shame of capture. Field Service Code, issued in 1941, reinforced this. Do not live in shame as a prisoner. Die to avoid the dishonor of being captured. This was not merely cultural preference. It was official military doctrine with legal and social consequences. Japanese soldiers who surrendered brought shame upon their families. Parents disowned, captured sons, wives divorced, captured husbands, communities shunned families of prisoners. The social cost of survival as a prisoner was often worse than death in combat. Japanese propaganda reinforced these beliefs with specific claims about American treatment of prisoners. Soldiers were told Americans tortured captives for information. Americans executed prisoners after interrogation. Americans mutilated bodies and took trophies, ears, teeth, skulls. Some of these claims had basis in reality. Documented cases existed of American soldiers taking Japanese remains as war trophies. Life magazine published a photograph in May 1943 showing an American woman posing with a Japanese skull sent to her by her boyfriend in the Pacific. The photograph caused controversy in the United States but confirmed Japanese propaganda claims. Americans did take trophies. Therefore, other claims about torture and execution seemed equally plausible. The result was a self-reinforcing cycle. Japanese soldiers believed Americans killed prisoners, so they fought to the death rather than surrender. This fanatical resistance made American soldiers less likely to attempt capturing prisoners, which reinforced Japanese belief that Americans took no prisoners. By 1945, American combat units in the Pacific had learned that offering surrender terms was often futile. Japanese soldiers attacked even when surrounded and out of ammunition. Wounded soldiers detonated grenades when Americans approached. Apparent surrender attempts were sometimes ruses to draw Americans into grenade range. The practical response was overwhelming firepower. Assume hostility until proven otherwise. Take prisoners when possible, but prioritize survival of American forces. The statistics reflected this reality. On Tarawa, in November 1943, American forces killed 4,700 Japanese defenders. They captured 17 prisoners, plus 129 Korean laborers who were not combatants. Kill ratio was 200. 76 to 1. On Saipan, in June and July 1944, American forces killed 29,000 Japanese soldiers. They captured 921 prisoners. Kill ratio was 31 to 1. On Iwo Jima, in February and March 1945, American forces killed 21,000 Japanese defenders. They captured 216 prisoners. Kill ratio was 97 to 1. These ratios were unprecedented in modern warfare. By comparison, German forces surrendered en masse when situations became hopeless. At Stalingrad, 91,000 German soldiers surrendered after the encirclement. In Tunisia, 275,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered in May 1943. In the Ruhr pocket, in April 1945, 325,000 German soldiers surrendered in 3 weeks. Germans understood that surrender meant captivity, but not execution. Japanese soldiers believed surrender meant torture and death. That belief kept them fighting long after military logic suggested surrender. The Japanese prisoners who did surrender fell into several categories. Some were unconscious when captured, wounded so severely they could not resist or commit suicide. Some were isolated from their units and effectively abandoned, cut off without orders or leadership. Some were recent conscripts who had not fully internalized the no-surrender doctrine, and a very few were career soldiers who made pragmatic calculations that survival in captivity was preferable to certain death in combat. Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto was in the last category. He had served in the Imperial Japanese Army since 1937. China, Philippines, now Iwo Jima. 8 years of combat. He had seen enough death to understand that dying achieved nothing if the strategic situation was hopeless. On Iwo Jima, by day 19 of the battle, the strategic situation was completely hopeless. Japanese forces were compressed into a pocket less than 1 square kilometer. No supplies, no reinforcements, no communication with headquarters. American artillery and naval gunfire pounded the pocket continuously. Flamethrower tanks burned out cave positions methodically. The death rate exceeded 50%. Survival beyond a few more days was impossible. Yamamoto made a decision. He would surrender. Not honorably. Honor was a luxury for men who believed victory remained possible. But practically. He was 34 years old. He had a wife and 2 children in Osaka. He had not seen in 3 years. If surrender meant even a small chance of seeing them again, that chance was worth the shame. He told 6 men in his unit his plan. 2 agreed to surrender with him. 4 refused. Those 4 died in a final banzai charge on February 26th. Yamamoto and his 2 men stayed hidden in a cave until American forces reached their position. They emerged with hands raised, expecting to be shot immediately. Instead, they were searched for weapons, given water, and evacuated to an aid station. At the aid station, they received medical treatment for minor wounds. Then they were transported to a holding area on the beach, then to a ship, then to Guam, then to Hawaii, then to California. Each stage of the journey reinforced the same impossible reality. They were not being tortured. They were not being executed. They were being processed through a bureaucratic system that treated them as administrative problems, not as enemies to be destroyed. The journey from Iwo Jima to Camp Carson took 3 weeks. The prisoners traveled by ship from Iwo Jima to Guam, 3 days. By ship from Guam to Pearl Harbor, 6 days. By ship from Pearl Harbor to San Francisco, 5 days. By train from San Francisco to Denver, 2 days. By truck from Denver to Camp Carson, 2 hours. At each stage, they expected conditions to worsen. Instead, conditions improved. On the ships, they received the same rations American sailors ate: canned meat, bread, coffee, fruit, cigarettes. The quantity was staggering. Japanese military rations at that stage of the war provided approximately 1,500 calories per day, often less. The rations on American ships provided over 3,000 calories per day. The prisoners gained weight during the voyage. Their bodies, accustomed to chronic malnutrition, responded to adequate nutrition with visible changes. Faces filled out, muscle tone improved, energy levels increased. At Pearl Harbor, they were held in a processing facility for 2 days. During processing, they underwent medical examinations. American doctors documented malnutrition, dental problems, parasitic infections, old untreated wounds. Treatment began immediately. Dental work for those with infected teeth, antibiotics for those with infections, deworming medication for those with parasites. The prisoners were baffled. They were enemies. Why were Americans spending resources on their health? The answer, had they understood American military medicine, was straightforward. The Geneva Convention required adequate medical care for prisoners. American military doctrine treated the Geneva Convention as binding policy, not optional guideline. Furthermore, preventing disease in prison camps protected American personnel who worked in those camps. Treating prisoners was both legally required and practically sensible. From Pearl Harbor, the prisoners were shipped to the mainland. The voyage to San Francisco took 5 days. Weather was rough. Many prisoners experienced seasickness, their first time on a large ship in open ocean. But even seasickness was preferable to what they had expected. No torture, no interrogation with beatings, no summary execution, just confinement in a hold with adequate food and water. At San Francisco, they were transferred to a train. The prisoners had never seen American trains. Japanese trains were smaller, less comfortable. This train had passenger cars with padded seats. The prisoners sat in those seats and watched America pass by the windows. Mountains, forests, farmland, cities. The landscape was vast and untouched by war. No bomb damage, no burned villages, no refugees. The scale of American territory was overwhelming. Japan was small, densely populated islands. America was an enormous continent with resources Japan could never match. One prisoner, a corporal named Hiroshi Tanaka, later wrote about this train journey. He said, seeing America's size made him understand Japan had lost the war before it began. An island nation with limited resources could not defeat a continental nation with seemingly unlimited resources. The fighting would continue because Japanese military culture prevented surrender. But the outcome was inevitable. Japan would be destroyed, not because Japanese soldiers lacked courage, but because Japan lacked the industrial capacity to sustain modern war against an enemy like America. These thoughts were dangerous. Tanaka kept them to himself, expressing defeatist sentiment, even among fellow prisoners, risked being labeled a traitor. In Japanese culture, accepting reality was considered betrayal if that reality contradicted official narrative. So prisoners stayed silent, watched America pass by train windows, and thought thoughts they could not speak aloud. The train arrived in Denver on March 6, 1945. From Denver, trucks transported prisoners to Camp Carson, 40 miles south. Camp Carson was a major training facility established in 1942, covering over 60,000 acres. It trained infantry divisions, tank battalions, mountain troops. At its peak, it housed 40,000 American soldiers. The POW compound occupied a small section of the base, separate from main training areas. The compound held prisoners from multiple Axis nations, Germans in one section, Italians in another, Japanese in a third. Each group was segregated to prevent conflict. The compound was not designed to look welcoming. It was surrounded by double barbed wire fences, 15 feet high, with guard towers at intervals. Floodlights illuminated the perimeter at night. Armed guards patrolled constantly. Escape was theoretically possible, but practically futile. The nearest city was 40 miles away. The terrain was high desert mountains. Winter temperatures dropped below 0 Fahrenheit. Anyone escaping would die of exposure before reaching civilization. But the security measures, intimidating as they appeared, were designed to contain prisoners, not abuse them. Inside the wire, conditions met Geneva Convention standards. Barracks were heated, food was adequate, medical care was available, recreation facilities existed, work assignments were optional, though refusing work meant forfeiting pay. Prisoners who worked earned 80 cents per day. That money could purchase cigarettes, candy, writing paper, stamps, and other items at the camp canteen. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. German and Italian prisoners had been at Camp Carson for months. They understood the system. They worked, earned money, bought luxuries, wrote letters home, played sports during recreation time. They had adapted to captivity. The Japanese prisoners had no context for this. Everything contradicted what they believed about American treatment of prisoners. When Sergeant Hayes finally got the 23 Japanese prisoners into their barracks on March 7th, he assumed the hard part was over. It was not. The hard part was convincing these men that their living conditions were permanent, not a temporary deception before execution. That night, none of the prisoners slept. They lay in the beds, uncomfortable with softness, after months on bare ground or wooden planks. They kept waiting for guards to enter and open fire. When morning came, and they were still alive, confusion deepened. Breakfast arrived at 0700 hours. 2 American soldiers pushed a cart with food containers, scrambled eggs, bacon, bread, butter, jam, coffee, milk. The portions were standard army issue, the same quantity American soldiers received. The Japanese prisoners examined the food suspiciously. Was it poisoned? Was this a final meal before execution? Sergeant Yamamoto decided to test it. He ate a full portion while the others watched. If he died, they would know. If he survived, the food was safe. Yamamoto did not die. The food was safe. It was also better than anything Japanese soldiers had eaten in years. Real eggs, not powdered. Real meat, not canned scraps. Fresh bread with butter. The coffee was real coffee, not barley substitute. By 1945, Japanese military rations had degraded to subsistence level. Soldiers in combat zones received rice, sometimes millet, occasionally fish or vegetables, usually canned or preserved. Fresh meat was rare. Fresh eggs were non-existent. Coffee was unknown. Japanese soldiers drank tea when available, or nothing when tea was unavailable. The rations American prisoners received at Camp Carson represented luxury by Japanese standards, not because Americans were being generous, but because standard American military rations were simply that abundant. The United States military fed its soldiers well and extended that same standard to prisoners as required by Geneva Convention. Over the following days, the pattern repeated: 3 meals daily, adequate portions, reasonable quality. The prisoners continued expecting the arrangement to end. Some trigger would reveal the deception, but days became weeks and nothing changed. The food kept coming. The heat kept running. The beds remained available. Medical care was provided when requested. One prisoner developed a severe toothache. He was taken to the camp dentist, an American captain who extracted the infected tooth and prescribed pain medication. The procedure was competent and professional. The prisoner expected torture disguised as dental work. Instead, he received legitimate medical treatment that resolved his problem. Another prisoner caught pneumonia from the temperature shock of moving from tropical Iwo Jima to cold Colorado. He was admitted to the camp infirmary, treated with sulfur drugs and antibiotics, and recovered in 10 days. During his hospitalization, he received the same medical care American soldiers would receive. The nursing staff was professional. The facility was clean. The medication was effective. When he returned to the barracks, he told the other prisoners what had happened. They struggled to reconcile this reality with their expectations. If Americans were going to kill them, why treat pneumonia? Why extract infected teeth? Why provide medical care that prolonged life? The cognitive dissonance was profound. Thomas Nakamura, the Nisei translator, watched this process unfold. He had experienced similar dissonance in reverse when his family was interned at Manzanar in 1942. He could not reconcile American ideals of freedom with forced relocation of citizens based solely on ethnicity. The contradiction had driven him to enlist. to prove through military service that Japanese Americans were loyal Americans. Now he was watching Japanese prisoners struggle with a different contradiction. They had been taught Americans were barbaric. The evidence showed Americans followed rules, treated prisoners humanely, and respected international law. Which reality was true? Nakamura understood that resolving this contradiction would take time. Cultural beliefs, deeply held since childhood, do not change because of a few weeks of contradictory evidence. The prisoners needed sustained proof that American treatment was consistent, not situational. By April 1945, the Japanese prisoners at Camp Carson had been in American custody for 6 weeks. They had adapted physically. Weight gain was universal. The combination of adequate nutrition and heated shelter restored body mass that combat and malnutrition had stripped away. Medical issues were being addressed systematically. Dental problems were fixed. Infections were treated. Parasites were eliminated. The prisoners were healthier than they had been in years, but psychological adaptation lagged behind physical adaptation. The prisoners remained convinced that current conditions were temporary. When the war ended, Americans would no longer need prisoners. At that point, mass executions would begin. This belief was reinforced by news from the Pacific. American forces were advancing. Iwo Jima was secured. Okinawa was being invaded. Bombing raids hit Japanese cities with increasing frequency. Japan was losing. When Japan lost, prisoners would become surplus population. Surplus population would be eliminated. Staff Sergeant Hayes tried to address these fears through Nakamura. The Geneva Convention prohibited executing prisoners. America followed the Geneva Convention. Prisoners would be repatriated after the war ended, not executed, but Hayes was asking prisoners to trust legal documents they had never read, issued by governments they had been taught to distrust, enforced by an international system they had no reason to believe existed. Why would they trust his words? The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In late April, the camp commandant organized a baseball game between American soldiers and prisoners. The idea seemed absurd to the Japanese prisoners, playing sports with the enemy for recreation. But German and Italian prisoners confirmed it was normal. They played soccer with guards regularly. Americans treated sports as leisure activity, not military training. The Japanese prisoners agreed to participate, mostly from curiosity. The game took place on April 28th. American team versus Japanese team. The Americans were better players. Baseball was popular in America, played from childhood. Some of the American soldiers had played competitively in high school or college. The Japanese prisoners knew baseball. The sport was popular in Japan before the war, but they had not played in years and were out of practice. The Americans won easily, 14-3, but the score was irrelevant. What mattered was the Americans played the game fairly. No cheating, no violence, no humiliation. They played to win, but within rules. After the game, both teams shared cigarettes and talked through Nakamura's translation. The conversation was awkward, stilted, two groups of men who had been trying to kill each other months earlier, now discussing baseball. But it was also genuine. Sergeant Hayes asked Sergeant Yamamoto if he had played baseball before the war. Yamamoto said he played in school. He had been a pitcher. Hayes said he had been a catcher in high school in Texas. They discussed pitching strategies through translation, both men reverting to technical discussion of a shared interest that transcended the war. That evening, Yamamoto told his men something important. The Americans were not pretending. This was not elaborate deception. Americans genuinely treated prisoners according to rules they believed in. The barracks were real. The food was real. The medical care was real. The baseball game was real. All of it was real. Some prisoners accepted this immediately. Others remained skeptical. But the consensus was shifting. Maybe survival was possible. Maybe they would live long enough to return to Japan. Maybe shame of capture was preferable to death if survival meant seeing family again. This realization changed behavior. Prisoners began accepting work assignments. The pay was minimal, 80 cents per day, but the work provided purpose and structure. Some prisoners worked in camp kitchens, others worked in maintenance, repairing buildings and equipment. A few worked in agriculture, helping grow vegetables for camp consumption. The work was not difficult. No one was beaten for working slowly. Breaks were regular. American supervisors treated Japanese prisoners the same way. They treated German or Italian prisoners as labor resources to be utilized efficiently, not as enemies to be punished. The canteen became important. Prisoners earned money and spent it on small luxuries. Cigarettes were most popular. American cigarettes were higher quality than Japanese cigarettes. Smooth tobacco, consistent manufacturing. Prisoners smoked American brands, Lucky Strike, Camel, Chesterfield, and discussed the differences. Candy was popular. Hershey bars, Tootsie Rolls, Baby Ruths. Sugar had been scarce in Japanese military rations. Candy represented abundance. Writing paper and stamps were important for letters home. The American military facilitated letters through neutral countries, primarily Switzerland. Letters were censored but not prohibited. Prisoners could write to family, inform them of survival, provide some reassurance. The letters often took months to arrive, if they arrived at all. Postal systems in Japan were disrupted by bombing, but the possibility of communication mattered psychologically. By May 1945, the character of the Japanese prisoner group had changed. They were no longer fatalistic men waiting for execution. They were prisoners adapting to captivity, making plans, thinking about futures beyond the war. When Germany surrendered on May 8th, the camp held a formation. The commandant informed all prisoners that European war had ended. German and Italian prisoners cheered. Their war was over. Repatriation would begin eventually. Japanese prisoners watched and understood their war continued, but they also understood the pattern. Germany surrendered. German prisoners were not executed. They were held pending repatriation. This supported Hayes's claims about Geneva Convention. When Japan surrendered, presumably the same rules would apply. Japanese prisoners would be held, then repatriated, not executed. The summer of 1945 brought new prisoners to Camp Carson as Pacific fighting intensified. Prisoners from Okinawa arrived in June and July. These men were even more traumatized than the Iwo Jima group. Okinawa was a bloodbath. 82 days of fighting. American casualties exceeded 50,000. Japanese casualties exceeded 100,000. Civilian casualties exceeded 100,000. The survivors, both military and civilian, emerged from caves and tunnels, starving, wounded, and psychologically broken. The established prisoners at Camp Carson helped orient newcomers. Sergeant Yamamoto explained the rules through camp translator. The barracks are real. The food is real. The medical care is real. Americans follow Geneva Convention. You will not be executed. Survival is possible. This mentoring was crucial. Without it, new prisoners went through the same terror the March group had experienced, convinced execution was imminent, unable to accept evidence that contradicted their beliefs. August 6th, 1945, news reached Camp Carson that an atomic bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima. Prisoners did not initially understand what this meant. The term atomic bomb was unfamiliar. The destruction was described as equivalent to thousands of conventional bombs. The casualty estimates were staggering. The prisoners struggled to process information. Was this propaganda? Was this exaggeration? Was this real? 3 days later, a second atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki. The prisoners understood this was real. No propaganda campaign would claim 2 such attacks. The implications were obvious. Japan could not withstand this level of destruction. Surrender was inevitable. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast. The war was over. The prisoners at Camp Carson heard the news through official channels and through Japanese-language radio broadcasts monitored by camp intelligence. Initial reactions were relief mixed with shame. Relief that fighting had ended, shame that Japan had surrendered. Japanese military culture had no framework for national surrender. Individual soldiers surrendered because of cowardice or weakness. But the emperor surrendering, the entire nation capitulating. This was unprecedented, incomprehensible, devastating. In the days following surrender, some prisoners became suicidal. Not all, not even most, but enough to require intervention. American camp officials implemented suicide watch. Guards monitored prisoners closely. Sharp objects were removed. Rope was prohibited. Belts were confiscated. The camp psychiatrist, A major named David Kleinman worked with Nakamura to provide counseling. Kleinman explained that surrender was not personal failure. Japan had fought a war it could not win against an enemy with overwhelming resources. Individual courage was irrelevant against industrial disparity. Japanese soldiers had fought as well as any soldiers in history, but courage does not overcome material disadvantage. Some prisoners accepted this framework, others rejected it, but the intensive monitoring prevented suicides during the immediate post-surrender crisis. As weeks passed, prisoners began thinking practically about repatriation. When would they go home? What would they find? Families intact or destroyed by bombing, jobs available or economy collapsed, honor maintained or social shame permanent? These questions had no answers. American officials could not provide timelines for repatriation. Logistics were complex, transportation was limited. Priority was given to American forces returning home. Prisoners would be repatriated eventually, but not immediately. In the meantime, they remained at Camp Carson. Some prisoners requested to stay in America. Not many, perhaps 24 out of the several hundred Japanese prisoners at Camp Carson. But those requests revealed important psychology. These men calculated that returning to Japan meant confronting social stigma as former prisoners. Staying in America, though culturally alien, might offer opportunities that Japan would deny them. American authorities rejected most requests. Prisoners would be repatriated, regardless of preference. A few exceptions were made for prisoners who provided valuable intelligence or who had legitimate persecution fears. But most prisoners returned to Japan between 1946 and 1948. Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto was repatriated in March 1946. He returned to Osaka to find his house destroyed by bombing. His wife and children had survived. Evacuated to the countryside, they were alive but struggling. Post-war Japan was devastated. Food shortages were severe. Jobs were scarce. The social fabric was shattered. Yamamoto found work as a laborer, heavy construction, rebuilding infrastructure. The pay was minimal. The hours were long. The work was physically demanding. But he was alive. Reunited with family, given a second chance he had not expected to receive. In 1952, Yamamoto wrote a letter to Staff Sergeant William Hayes. He had kept Hayes's address from Camp Carson. The letter was brief, written in carefully practiced English. It thanked Hayes for treating him humanely during captivity. It acknowledged that American treatment had been correct and professional. It stated that without that treatment, Yamamoto would have died, believing Americans were barbarians. Instead, he had learned that enemies could be honorable. Hayes received the letter at his ranch outside Amarillo. He was surprised. He had not expected any prisoner to remember him, much less write years later. He wrote back. A correspondence developed, brief letters exchanged yearly, two former enemies maintaining connection through simple acknowledgement of shared humanity during inhumane times. Yamamoto died in 1983. Hayes died in 1997. Both men lived long lives shaped by brief intersection during war. The story of Japanese prisoners refusing to enter Camp Carson Barracks is documented in multiple sources: camp records, prisoner interviews, guard testimonies, psychological assessments. The incident was not unique. Similar scenarios occurred at other camps. Japanese prisoners encountered American treatment that contradicted everything they believed. The cognitive dissonance was universal. The broader pattern was clear. Japanese prisoners expected torture and execution. American camps provided heated barracks, adequate food, medical care, and recreation. The gap between expectation and reality was so large that prisoners could not accept reality without sustained proof. This gap revealed something fundamental about the war. Japanese soldiers fought with extraordinary courage, based on beliefs that were objectively false. They believed surrender meant death, therefore they fought to the death, but surrender actually meant captivity. under Geneva Convention rules. Had Japanese soldiers known this, surrender rates would have been higher. Combat would have been less as fanatical. Casualties on both sides would have been lower. But Japanese military culture and propaganda prevented this knowledge from spreading. Prisoners who returned to Japan after the war were ostracized. Their testimony about American treatment was dismissed as collaboration or weakness. The official narrative remained that surrender was dishonorable and death was preferable. This narrative persisted for decades. The treatment of Japanese prisoners in American camps contrasted sharply with treatment of Allied prisoners in Japanese camps. American prisoners of war held by Japan faced systematic brutality, starvation rations, forced labor, medical neglect, physical abuse. Execution of prisoners was common. The Bataan Death March in April 1942 killed between 5,000 and 11,000 Filipino and American prisoners through forced march, starvation, and execution. POW camps in Japan, Thailand, and Burma had death rates exceeding 25%. Japanese military culture viewed surrender as ultimate disgrace. Therefore, enemy soldiers who surrendered deserved no respect or humane treatment. This belief directly violated Geneva Convention, but Japanese military authorities considered Geneva Convention a Western construct irrelevant to Japanese warrior traditions. The disparity in treatment had long-term consequences. American veterans of Pacific War carried justified anger about Japanese treatment of prisoners. Many refused to forgive or forget. The discovery of atrocities in Philippines, Burma, and Japanese home islands reinforced these attitudes. Japanese war crimes were prosecuted at Tokyo trials. Commanders responsible for prisoner abuse were convicted and executed. But individual guards and officers who committed atrocities often escaped punishment. The legacy of Japanese prisoner abuse poisoned post-war relations. American veterans organizations opposed normalization with Japan for decades. Some veterans refused to purchase Japanese products for the rest of their lives. The trauma was deep and permanent. Conversely, Japanese prisoners held in America had different experiences. They returned to Japan with knowledge that Americans had treated them according to international law. This knowledge influenced post-war Japanese attitudes toward America. Not universally, not immediately, but gradually. The generation of Japanese who experienced American occupation saw Americans enforce law, rebuild infrastructure, provide food aid, and establish democratic institutions. This reality contradicted wartime propaganda about American barbarism. The cognitive dissonance Japanese prisoners experienced in camps was replicated on national scale during occupation. What Japan believed about America was wrong. This realization enabled post-war reconciliation. If Japanese understanding of America had been accurate, if Americans had actually tortured and executed prisoners as Japanese propaganda claimed, reconciliation would have been impossible. But American behavior, both toward prisoners and during occupation, demonstrated that propaganda was false. This created foundation for alliance that persists today. The United States held approximately 5,600 Japanese prisoners in camps on American mainland during World War II. Small number compared to German and Italian prisoners, which exceeded 400,000. The low number reflected Japanese military culture that prevented surrender except under extraordinary circumstances. Those 5,600 prisoners represented soldiers who chose survival over death. That choice was controversial in Japan. Returnees faced discrimination. Employment was difficult. Social relationships were damaged. Some prisoners never fully reintegrated, but they survived. They had families. They lived lives that would have been impossible if they had followed orders to fight to death. Sergeant Yamamoto's letter to Staff Sergeant Hayes acknowledged this. American treatment gave him a chance to survive. He took that chance. He returned to Japan. He rebuilt his life. His children grew up. His grandchildren never knew war. None of that would have happened if he had died on Iwo Jima as his training demanded. The barracks at Camp Carson, the heated rooms that Japanese prisoners feared to enter in March 1945, represented a choice: enter and accept survival, refuse and maintain honor culture, that defined survival as shameful. The prisoners eventually entered. That decision meant accepting that everything they believed about American treatment was wrong. It meant acknowledging that their own military had lied to them. It meant surviving a war they were supposed to die in. These were difficult realizations, but they were true. The barracks were real. The heat was real. The beds were real. The food was real. The medical care was real. All of it was real. Americans followed rules even when dealing with enemies. This was power of a different kind than military force. It was power of institutional consistency. America possessed industrial capacity to wage war across oceans, but America also possessed institutional capacity to treat prisoners humanely while fighting that war. Both capabilities mattered. Industrial capacity won battles. Institutional consistency won peace. The Japanese prisoners who stood in the cold Colorado air in March 1945 were witnessing this dual capacity. They were seeing barracks that represented American ability to house prisoners adequately, but they were also seeing American commitment to legal frameworks that protected even enemies. That commitment was not guaranteed. Many Americans wanted revenge for Pearl Harbor, for Bataan, for atrocities documented throughout Pacific War. Killing prisoners would have been emotionally satisfying and strategically irrelevant. Prisoners provided no military value. But America followed Geneva Convention anyway, not because prisoners deserved mercy, but because America believed in rule of law even during war. This belief separated America from enemies who abandoned law when convenient. Japan executed prisoners because Japanese military culture considered surrender shameful. Germany executed prisoners based on racial ideology that classified certain populations as subhuman. Soviet Union executed prisoners for political reasons. America followed Geneva Convention, not perfectly, not universally, but systematically. The institutional commitment was real. This commitment had strategic value beyond morality. It encouraged surrender. Enemy soldiers who knew they would be treated humanely were more likely to surrender when situations became hopeless. This reduced casualties on both sides. It provided intelligence from prisoner interrogations. It created post-war populations who had direct experience with American behavior under stress. Japanese prisoners returned to Japan, having seen America up close. That knowledge influenced post-war Japanese attitudes in ways that would have been impossible if American treatment had matched Japanese propaganda. The 23 prisoners standing outside the barracks at Camp Carson could not see these larger patterns. They only saw a building they were afraid to enter. But their fear and its eventual resolution represented something larger. It represented collision between propaganda and reality. Propaganda said Americans were barbaric. Reality showed Americans followed rules. The collision forced choice: reject reality and maintain beliefs, or accept reality and revise beliefs. The prisoners eventually chose reality. They entered the barracks. They accepted heat, beds, food, medical care. They survived the war. They returned to Japan. They lived lives shaped by that choice. The barracks are gone now. Camp Carson was redesignated Fort Carson in 1957. It remains an active military installation. The prisoner of war compound was dismantled decades ago. The buildings were demolished or repurposed. No physical evidence remains of the moment in March 1945 when Japanese prisoners stood in the cold, refusing to enter. But the moment mattered. It represented something fundamental about how wars are fought and how they end. Battles are won by courage and weapons. Wars are won by logistics and institutions. Peace is won by demonstrating that your institutions function even under stress of war. America demonstrated this during World War II. The demonstration took many forms: industrial production, logistical superiority, technological innovation. But it also took form of heated barracks and adequate food and medical care for prisoners who expected torture and execution. That demonstration had lasting impact. It enabled post-war reconciliation. It established American credibility. It showed that American power was not just military force, but institutional consistency. The prisoners who eventually entered those barracks learned this lesson personally. Some accepted it easily, others struggled, but all of them survived to return to Japan with knowledge that American treatment, however unexpected, had been lawful and humane. That knowledge mattered. It still matters. It reminds us that how we treat enemies during war shapes what happens after war ends. Cruelty breeds lasting hatred. Lawful treatment enables eventual reconciliation. America chose lawful treatment. That choice had costs. Resources devoted to prisoner care could have been used elsewhere. But the choice also had benefits. It maintained moral authority. It encouraged surrender. It enabled post-war relationships. These benefits exceeded costs. The 23 Japanese prisoners who refused to enter barracks at Camp Carson on March 7, 1945, eventually entered. They survived the war. They went home. Some thrived, some struggled, but all of them lived lives that would have been impossible if they had followed their training to fight to death on Iwo Jima. The heated room with real beds was not just shelter. It was offer of survival in place of expected death. The offer was real. The survival was real. The reconciliation that followed was real. All of it began with a simple choice. Enter the building and accept reality, or refuse and maintain false beliefs. They chose reality. That choice changed everything. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.